Greetings, everyone. My name is Tim Keyes, and this is God Save the King. You can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told radio network. So all you have to do is go to www.truthbetoldnetwork.org and click on the big listen button, and you will be dialed into God Save the King. Many other great shows on Truth Be Told Network as well. And in addition, not only can you listen directly on the Truth Be Told Network website, you can also listen to God Save the King again every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on your Android app, on MyTuner, on Wi-Fi radio, and of course on Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. And finally, you can also listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network by dialing in. You can actually call in at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977 and listen to God Save the King and the Truth Be Told radio network that way. So here we are. This is actually show number 4 for us. As my manner is in some of my lectures and teachings and things like that, I like to give the date of the original broadcast. So I'm actually recording this on Wednesday, September 15th, and it will broadcast on Friday the 17th. But as I've mentioned before, this is an ongoing investigation. God Save the King is an ongoing 30-year research project. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. And as I've already said in a couple of the broadcasts, it's an ongoing investigation, which means I discover new stuff all the time. So I find it helpful to tell you when the original broadcast was, because then if I have to go back and correct it, or if I learn something new that's exciting, I can reference the exact broadcast and say, hey, I said this at that time, but guess what? I've got new information on that. Let's talk about that. So what I want to talk about today, we started to do this a couple of episodes ago, but I really want to share kind of in depth the fundamental premises that undergird God Save the King. Because as I've already mentioned, once again, ongoing 30 plus year research project, new information coming to light all the time on this. And the intention here is simply to tell the nativity story, the real nativity story, as it actually would have happened, as opposed to the traditional nativity story, which I have come to call Christian mythology. And yes, that is a very loaded phrase. I understand that. I get that. But it's also a very accurate phrase. The traditional nativity story is Christian mythology because it just really simply did not go down that way. And part of the reason I call it that, we've talked about this before, is it's the beginning of the Lord of the Rings movie by Peter Jackson. Now I'm taking this from the movie, not from the book. Okay, so I don't remember who this quote actually comes from in the book, but in the movie, it's Lady Galadriel is doing a voiceover narrating the beginning of the movie, and it's the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. It's the beginning of the first movie of the 3-movie trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit, okay? And she has this great quote because she's talking about the history of the ring. And it's really a fantastic quote because she says, history became legend, legend became myth, and some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. And I really feel the exact same way about the nativity story because, I'm not trying to fault people for their enthusiasm or their passion. I am sure that lots of people over the centuries, frankly, over the centuries of trying to tell the nativity story, they weren't aware of the fact that they were being taken in by a tradition that wasn't really accurate. They were operating on the best information they had, and they were endeavoring to love God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength. So it's not intended to be critical in that way. But once again, I just want to tell the story, and I want to tell it, crack open the Bible, read the Bible, and go, oh, look, it went like this. And as I've also mentioned before, this is fairly typical when it comes to a documentary or a docuseries or anything like that. So it doesn't matter, pick your historical figure. you can pick anybody. And my favorite examples that I cite frequently are like, Wyatt Earp, or William Wallace, or Genghis Khan, or Ragnar Lothbrok, right? All very big names in history that have all had documentaries done about them. Or here's a good one. How about the OK Corral? Wyatt Earp, right? You watch a documentary about Wyatt Earp and about the OK Corral, and I guarantee you, in the first 5 minutes, the narrator or the host or whoever it's going to be is going to say, we're so used to the traditional story. We've had so many movies made, and we've told the traditional story, the legend. See, there you go. History became legend, and then legend became myth, right? Now, somewhere mixed into that is the truth, right? It almost always started out as a legitimate historical event that actually happened, but this is like a cold case. It's like a murder case that has gone cold. The eyewitnesses haven't been around for a long time, so we need to investigate using the best sources we have to determine what this actually would have looked like. So my point here, like I said, is that I've been doing this for a long time, and it has taken me a long time to chip away at the traditional story and discover the truth about it, right? So let's start with this. This is kind of interesting. Let me see. Once again, I'm using internet technology here. I want to try to get a something up on screen here to share with you guys. This was something that I actually tripped over online yesterday. I was just doing my social media thing, right? And let's see, it should be, let's get it, do this, and there it is. Okay, and we want to do that. Nope, that. There we go. That's what I want. Okay, so this was, I found this online yesterday, doing a little bit of the social media thing, and look at this meme. It reads, okay, let me see if I can use my cursor. So it reads, what do people pretend is in the Bible, but is absolutely not in the Bible? Isn't that interesting? And then, of course, go over here, look at my cursor over here. That's me commenting, and I said, Christmas, okay? Because Christmas just frankly is not in the Bible. And I know for some people that's going to come as a huge surprise. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to go, "Oh my God, you're kidding. What do you mean Christmas is not in the Bible?" And the simple truth of the matter is that Christmas is not in the Bible. The word Christmas is never used, and even the idea of Christmas is never used. Now, I'm splitting hairs because the birth of Jesus, the nativity, is absolutely in the Bible, but Christmas is not in the Bible. Likewise, December 25th is not in the Bible. I can virtually guarantee that there are lots of Christians who believe that we are told in the Bible that Jesus was born on December 25th, and that simply isn't true. It's not there. It's not there at all, right? And then finally, something else that we're not told in the Bible is that we are never told to celebrate his birthday. There's no commandment. There's not even an inference, okay, that we would be, that we're commanded to celebrate Jesus's birthday, in the Bible. It's just not there. It's just not there. So isn't it interesting that there are so many things in the Bible that, or I said that wrong. Isn't it interesting that there are so many things that we think are in the Bible and they're not, right? They're not in the Bible. So let's go back there real quick. Let's get you to take a quick look at this again. What do people pretend is in the Bible but is absolutely not in the Bible? And I said Christmas, right? Christmas isn't there. So there's Christmas isn't there. December 25th isn't there. The commandment to celebrate his birthday simply is not there, right? So isn't that interesting? So this is, what my project has been about for 30 years is, okay, well, what is there? What does the Bible tell us? And I shared in an earlier episode that when I began this research, a long time ago, I made what I think is actually a very understandable error. And I think a lot of other researchers like me made the same error, which is that we were introduced to the notion that the hypothesis that Jesus was not born on December 25th, right? So, but we assumed that the story, however, remained the same, that the traditional nativity story was in effect, quote unquote, accurate. Okay. It's just that we had the date wrong. Well, what I discovered over years of research is that changing the date changes the story. And that I discovered that there's a lot of misconceptions. I mean, I listed several of these in a previous episode, that there are certain misconceptions about the traditional nativity story that just simply aren't true, right? The shepherds and the magi were not there on the same night. Very explicitly clear in the Bible that they were not there on the same night. Mary did not deliver the same night they arrived in Bethlehem. I believe that Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem several months before she gave birth. It wasn't, she didn't arrive there 8 or 9 months pregnant and then deliver. They traveled to Bethlehem from Nazareth, I believe, when Mary was about 3 or 4 months pregnant, right? Very shortly after she returned to Nazareth after visiting Elizabeth, she and Joseph would have completed their nuptials, and then the two of them made the decision together to, quote unquote, leave Nazareth, and then the registration from Augustus Caesar providentially popped on the scene, which gave them the perfect excuse to leave Nazareth. And I believe they, frankly, did not intend to come back. Okay, so that's a misconception. Jesus wasn't born in a stable, right? We are told he was laid in a manger, but that is not the same as born in a stable. And once again, the misunderstanding comes from our Western understanding of where we would find a manger, right? We think the logical place to find a manger is in a stable, but it turns out that in Near Eastern culture at that time, a separate dwelling for your animals was not the common practice. Most people simply could not afford that. So their household animals were kept in their house. Okay, which means the manger was in the living room. Okay, so Jesus was born in a very typical Judean home, right? So they weren't neglected when Jesus was born. And clearly Joseph and Mary were both from the house and lineage of David, which meant that Bethlehem was their ancestral hometown. So the likelihood that they knew people there is extremely high. Extremely high. And we'll get into more depth on all of these, on another occasion. I'm just running you through the list really quickly, because once I began to realize that there were so many fundamental errors, that's when I had to dig even deeper and go, okay, what are we missing? What are we missing here? And how do I, begin to put the puzzle together to tell the story how it really would have looked? And an illustration that I'm going to use frequently, I'm going to repeat this illustration many, many times, is that this is kind of like doing a jigsaw puzzle where either you don't have a picture, or you do the puzzle upside down. You dump all the pieces out on the table, and instead of turning them picture side up, right, you turn them picture side down, and you're just going off of the shape of the pieces. You don't know what the picture is like until you finish it, right? Or maybe you should say, I dump all the pieces out on the table, but it's in a plain cardboard box. There's no picture on the front of the box that tells me what the picture is supposed to look like. So I've got to gather all the pieces together and go, okay, well, these are obviously the border pieces, and then these pieces all have blue in them, and these pieces all have red in them. And you start to group the evidence together and very slowly see which pieces fit together until you can start to get at least an idea what the picture looks like. So over 30 years of research, I have developed some fundamental precepts that are at the core of this research. So I want to take the time to share these with you, because we will refer back to these over and over and over again throughout this research, okay? So obviously the first one, the single most significant misconception promoted by the traditional nativity story is the notion that Jesus of Nazareth was born on December 25th. And this is despite the fact that there is no explicit or even implicit birth date given in Scripture. Now, here's another very important point right away. I do believe we are told his birth date in the Bible, but I am choosing my words very, very carefully. His birth date is not given explicitly. His birth date is not given implicitly. His birth date is given cryptically. And all you have to do is go back to the last session we recorded last week, in conjunction with the anniversary of his birth on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Teruah, the day of trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets. I believe Jesus was born on a Hebrew feast day. So last week, a big part of the show was devoted to looking at this cryptic reference to his birth, which would have been on September 11th, 3 BC. But the reference that we have comes from a combination of Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, and Genesis 49, verse 10. Two witnesses, by the mouth of two witnesses shall all things be confirmed, right? So we have a witness from the Old Testament and a witness from the New Testament that what they describe is an astronomical sign that would have been visible on the western horizon between roughly 6:30 and 8 o'clock p.m. on September 11th, 3 BC. And the sign that is given, we are told in Revelation that this is the sign of his birth, that a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, that she travailed in pain to be delivered, and she brought forth a man-child that was to rule all nations. That is the sign that is given in Revelation 12 about the birth of Jesus Christ, okay? So once again, no explicit date, no implicit date, but once you decipher the cryptic reference to his verse, we discover that it really is quite explicit. It's just that it's not stated explicitly, it's stated cryptically, okay? So the incorrect birth date, combined with, frankly, hundreds of years of unsubstantiated tradition, has resulted in, ironically, a story that is almost universally accepted, but is ironically and tragically almost completely devoid of biblical accuracy. It's really stunning how much of the traditional nativity story is inaccurate, that it's simply not correct, as I illustrated a moment ago by saying, well, this traditional component is wrong. This wasn't born in a stable. Mary didn't ride a donkey. The journey to Bethlehem was not extremely hazardous. It wasn't easy. Travel back then isn't what travel is today, but we'll talk about that, right? The shepherds and the magi not there at the same time. There weren't three kings. There was a lot more. It was a massive entourage that freaked out Herod the Great, right? So, like I said, these are just common misconceptions. And when you start to realize that there's so many misconceptions, you eventually get to the point where you reach critical mass and you start to realize that the story just doesn't hold up anymore. And as a matter of fact, if we were in a court of law, see, now the rules for historical evidence, the rules for historical investigation are frankly much more like the rules of a courtroom than they are the rules of a laboratory, okay? And this is a very important distinction, because today all kinds of people are all abuzz about follow the science, follow the science, follow the science, right? Well, the better word would be to say follow the evidence. Not follow the science, follow the evidence. Because if you're saying follow the science, by implication, you're saying, well, that we should use the scientific method, right? Now, we all went to high school or maybe even college, and in either chemistry class or in biology class, we learned about the scientific method. And the scientific method says that you develop a repeatable experiment. You start by developing a hypothesis, and then you develop a repeatable experiment that can be performed under controlled conditions, right? And then you perform that experiment 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, whatever makes sense. And then you collect your data, and then you draw a conclusion from the data you have collected, right? So if we attempt to combine 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, and we perform that experiment 1,000 times, we're going to get water 1,000 times. That's a clear example of how the scientific method hopefully works, right? And when it's done that way, and when you get the same answer every time, well, then you can say the science is conclusive. And now that's a really interesting statement, to say the science is conclusive, because how many times have we seen in the news lately that someone tried to say, well, the science on this matter is settled? And no, it's not settled. There's all kinds of scientists out there saying, no, I disagree with those conclusions, right? I don't agree with that conclusion at all. So guess what that means? The science isn't settled. If you've got 70% of the scientists saying one thing and you got 30%, yeah, sure, you may have a majority, but you got 30% of the scientists saying, no, it didn't happen that way. Then no, the science isn't settled, right? Because if you're following the scientific method, then you should be having, and the scientific method is working, okay, then you should have very high numbers in order for you to be able to say, no, we pretty much got this one nailed down. This is how it is. It's got to be up over 90%, 95, 98%. And then you can start saying, all right, this one's pretty much a no-brainer. We've got this one figured out because we have researched it. We've done the experiment. We've done the experiment under controlled conditions, and we have gotten the same answer over and over and over and over and over and over again. And the exceptions are either non-existent or very rare, okay? Now, the historical method is not like that because, like I said, the historical method of investigation is much more like proving a case in a courtroom. And as a matter of fact, it's virtually identical to attempting to prove a cold case, right? Now, a cold case means a case, and it's almost always a murder case because murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. If you're trying to prove a murder case that is 25 or 50 or 75 years old, it's a cold case, but the principals are no longer around. They're either dead or they're in jail or they're unavailable or something like that. So the accused, the eyewitnesses, the investigators, they're not around to consult about the case. So now you have to build a case using what we would call circumstantial evidence. Now, that phrase gets a bad rap from television because we've all watched way too much television, way too many crime stories, way too much, CSI and, Law and Order and stuff like that. And we think that circumstantial evidence is a bad thing. No, it's not. Circumstantial evidence is evidence. It's real evidence. The question is how much circumstantial evidence do you have? Because if you've only got a very few pieces of circumstantial evidence, that doesn't mean much. But if you've got 20 or 30 or 50 pieces of circumstantial evidence, that says a lot. So if you've got, we have video surveillance footage of the suspect's car outside the building at the time of the crime. We've got video surveillance footage of the suspect himself outside the building at the time of the crime. We've got video surveillance footage in the lobby of the suspect in the building at the time of the crime. We have blood evidence from in the building. We have fingerprint evidence from in the building. We have DNA evidence in the building. We have the suspect's blood on the victim. We have the victim's blood on the suspect. And you just keep going ding, 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 all these different pieces of circumstantial evidence. And you build up, like I said, 30, 40, 50, 70 pieces of circumstantial evidence. That's how they solve a cold case. That's how it works, okay? Historical evidence is the same kind of thing because historical research is rooted and grounded in recognizing that we only have fragmentary evidence. We don't have anywhere near the amount of evidence that we would like to have. So what you have to do is you have to take the pieces that we do have and then do what is called conjecture, right? But it needs to be reasonable conjecture, reasonable speculation, right? And so once again, see, we're all familiar, okay? We are all familiar with the phrase reasonable doubt from watching too much television, too much, Law and Order on television. We all think we know what reasonable doubt means. Well, let me tell you what reasonable doubt means. See, in the example I just gave you, let's say that that's exactly what we're doing, right? That we're sitting on a jury in a cold case and the prosecution is, presenting their evidence and they rattle off, they're summarizing, it's their closing statements, and they're summarizing. They say, yeah, we've got 60 pieces of circumstantial evidence. We've got video surveillance, car video surveillance of the man. We got the list I just gave. I won't repeat the whole list, but they've got item after item after item after item after item after item after item, right? And then the defense gets up there and says, but wait a second, isn't it possible that someone else could have done this, not the suspect? And that question exactly illustrates what most people are not aware of. The question isn't, is it possible? Of course, it's always possible, okay? There's always that totally bizarre, rare possibility where none of the evidence truly adds up, and there's this ridiculously bizarre situation where someone else might have done it. But that's not the question. The question is not what is possible. The question is what is reasonable, okay? And when you present that much circumstantial evidence, it is not reasonable to conclude that it was something else. It's only reasonable to conclude that this must be the answer, because all of the what we call positive evidence, all of the positive evidence we have points to this conclusion. Therefore, it is reasonable for us to conclude, and it is not reasonable for us to doubt. That is what that phrase actually means. So it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Simply saying, well, isn't it possible? That's not a reasonable doubt. That's unreasonable, because of course it's possible, but the likelihood is close to zero, right? So yeah, a 0.0001 chance, that's not a reasonable doubt. That's an extraordinary exception, okay? So when we're talking about this, how historical evidence works, if we were making our case, see, now you got to back up and you got to think about what is called a grand jury at the moment, right? So the grand jury is how we determine, should there be a trial? Should arrests be made? Should an investigation be made? Should subpoenas be issued? Should search warrants be issued? This is what happens in a grand jury, which is the preliminary evidence to determine, is there enough evidence to investigate further, okay? And this is what is known. Now, I'm not an attorney. I'm not an expert. I've just, looked this stuff up and, become familiar with legal terminology a little bit. I'm not an expert, but this is what is known as a prima facie case, right? Prima facie means on its face, right? So if we are in a grand jury and the prosecution presents its evidence and that evidence is insufficient, right? It's not sufficient to warrant further investigation, then they have not made what is known as a prima facie case. There's not enough evidence to warrant further investigation. If we could do this experiment, right, in a courtroom right now, where we could wipe out, we could erase, okay, this is the problem, right? If we could erase all of the prejudice that exists, right? Because that's the problem right now, right? The traditional nativity story is prejudicial, okay? So we would have to find a jury that could actually be objective and that is not influenced by the prejudicial traditional nativity story, right? And then we were to try to present what is known as positive evidence that Jesus was born on December 25th, we would not be able to meet the requirements of a prima facie case. It would not be possible because there simply is no biblical positive evidence that leads us to investigate a December 25th birthday. So the reason I share this, the reason I went there is because this is a fundamental premise that is behind God Save the King. Fundamental premise number one is that he wasn't born on December 25th and that there is no positive evidence that leads us to investigate December 25th, right? So if we were to erase the whole thing, start with a blank slate, start with a white canvas, and say, okay, what is our positive evidence that leads us to look at this date or that date or the other date? There is no positive evidence that directs you to look towards December 25th. You would eliminate December 25th very, very, very quickly. You just eliminate it, right? So that's fundamental premise number one. Jesus was not born on December 25th. Now, fundamental premise number two is that, here you go, tradition is not evidence. Because people will try to say, well, wait a second, but we've been celebrating his birthday on December 25th for 200 years or 500 years or 1,000 years, or, they'll try to claim 1,800 years, okay? And all of those dates are relevant. I didn't pick those dates at random, okay? Because the earliest references to a December 25th birth date, they do pop up in like the 3rd century. Okay, like around 210 AD is when we get one of the first pieces of evidence that maybe he was born on December 25th. The problem is that 200 years after his public ministry is way too long of a time frame. So now there is the real possibility that it's simply not correct, right? So here, this is a perfect example. You have a single piece of evidence from roughly 210 AD, and it's a document. I've got it in my notes. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I'll look it up and I'll share it with you. That was by, who was that? Rats. I can't pull it up out of the files of my mind. I'll probably remember as I'm talking about something else who this document was, right? And then you have to go to about the middle of the 4th century to get the next historical reference in a document. And that was in the calendar of Philocalus. But see, that's 2 pieces of evidence. That's 2 pieces of circumstantial evidence, both from much later, too far, way too long, and you can't corroborate them. So it's a single piece of evidence or 2 pieces of evidence that stand alone trying to claim that Jesus was born on December 25th. Well, that doesn't prove anything. And frankly, it contradicts what the Bible says, because we burned through this pretty quickly in a different episode, and we will go through it in detail, because this is what we do. This is what God Save the King is all about, is that I want to take the time to go through the evidence slowly and present it to you. So this is a summary, and in a future episode, we'll go through it quickly. But as I mentioned last episode, the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, and especially Luke, contains more chronological references than virtually any other section of Scripture. It's amazing how many chronological references are there. So all we have to do is take those chronological references, decipher what they mean, and then cross-reference them with each other, okay? So if we cross-reference the reign of Augustus Caesar with the reign of Herod the Great, with the governorship of Quirinius, with the course of Abijah, which was when, John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, was serving in the temple, right? These all have chronological information. And when you decipher these and unpack these and then cross-reference them with each other, what they do is they start to narrow the time frame when we can look, right? So now we start to focus our investigation on a certain period of time. And then lo and behold, and this was a huge big part of last week, was the sign of Revelation 12:1 and Genesis 49:10, because that is an astronomical sign that is very unique. Okay, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon underneath her feet, on her head a crown of 12 stars, and then the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. All of those there. So there it is. It's a code. It's a code, right? It's cryptic. It's a code. Once we decode what all of that means and plug it into an astronomy program in a computer, we can see that all of those pieces fit together on September 11th, 3 BC. That's the stunning thing, right? So that's why I'm pretty darn convinced that that is when Jesus was born. Now, as I've also mentioned, there's lots of other theories. There's lots of other theories that place it in the spring, place his birth in the spring. I've looked at those. In my opinion, they don't really hold up. And they especially don't hold up because of the astronomy. That's the biggest thing. The astronomy points you towards the fall, right? And there are other fall dates they're also in the fall, but they just pinpoint a different date. So I like those because I think the bulk of the evidence remains the same. They just reach a slightly different specific conclusion, right? So like I said, fundamental premise number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th, right? Fundamental premise number two, tradition is not evidence. Evidence is not evidence, right? And, the traditional story is just so ingrained in our collective psyche that I know a lot of people hear this and they flip out. They go, no, that just can't be. That can't be. That can't be. But we have to remember that traditions in history, and remember the example I gave. Let's talk about Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral, or let's talk about, William Wallace and the Battle of Stirling, right? Or, any other historical figure. Unfortunately, legends and myths, okay, start to become like the children's telephone game on steroids, right? And of course, the children's telephone game is that you tell a simple story to a child and you whisper it in his ear, and then I remember this from school. I remember doing this in kindergarten, where you had all the kids in the class sat in a circle on the floor, and then the first student whispered it to the second, and the second to the third, and the third to the fourth, and you went all the way back around the ring until you got back to the beginning, and then the last person would tell the story, and then the first person is right there, and there would be just no resemblance whatsoever between the two stories. In fact, it frequently had become completely nonsensical, right? Completely nonsensical. And another illustration I use is that when we examine the misconceptions, okay, when you examine one misconception and then correct it, a lot of times what happens is that reveals a second misconception. And then when you correct that one, then it reveals another. And then when you correct that misconception, it reveals another, and so on. And it becomes dominoes, right? It becomes a line of dominoes that just topple one after the other, after the other, after the other, because you keep exposing and then correcting misconceptions, right? So now, once you realize that so many of the misconceptions are incorrect and that tradition is not evidence, right? Then when we discover, and we'll get into this again, I keep saying this, I'm sorry that I keep saying this over and over and over again, but it's just true because it's what we're going to do. As we proceed, each episode is going to go more in depth, and we are going to more closely examine the evidence. This is just about the fundamental. This is still introduction. This is fundamental premises that undergird, okay, the real nativity story and the research I've done and how it works, okay? But now, instead of having a single line of dominoes, I want you to imagine what we see on social media sometimes, where someone has put together this massive domino puzzle, right? It's thousands of dominoes, and it all clicks off with one domino that they knock over, and then it goes down a line, and then that line splits into 3 lines, and then that splits into 5 lines, and then 7, and then it gets to this big layout of dominoes, and it knocks it over, and oh, look what happens. It exposes a picture, right? And these things are multi-dimensional, and it's not all, they have it climbing stairs and going across the chute and da 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 da, and you wind up with this really complex picture that you didn't know was there, right? So it's a really very good illustration that it's more than just a single line of dominoes. It's one of these elaborate multi-dimensional puzzles of tumbling dominoes that reveal hidden pictures as the dominoes topple, right? So once again, number 1, not born on December 25th. Number 2, tradition is not evidence, okay? And then number 3, the traditional nativity story is rarely told in its historical context. Yeah, there's a few historical figures that are mentioned, okay? But it's pretty rare, okay? They might mention Augustus Caesar because of the registration, okay? The oath of allegiance to Augustus Caesar that's mentioned, the quote unquote taxation, right? So a lot of times they mention Augustus. Frequently they mention Herod. Herod's the king, right? The Roman appointed king of the Jews. Sometimes they mention Quirinius, the governor of Syria. Now, we will definitely get into that at some point, because that at first glance appears to be really problematic, but actually that one has been resolved. We know a lot about Quirinius from historical records. We know who he was. We know what his assignments were for the Roman Empire, and it all actually fits together just fine. There's no contradiction there at all, actually, right? But how often, here's an example, right? How often are we told about the slaughter of the innocents in a nativity play, right? That we all know the story, because in Sunday school, as opposed to the nativity play, that's when we got told about the slaughter of the innocents, okay? Now, this is ugly. This is really, really ugly. This is really harsh, but this is also reality. It's also why this teaching series is called God Save the King, because Herod was a ruthless tyrant who was paranoid about his throne. And there's a lot of backstory here. So this is exactly the point. This is exactly the point. We are never told the historical background of what was going on at the time, and then we plug in the nativity story to this historical background. We don't realize that about 60 years, roughly 60 years before Jesus was born, there was a civil war in Israel, okay, between 2 princes, Judean princes, over who would inherit the throne, okay? Because the queen, get ready for that one, okay? The queen of Israel, how many of you out there know there was actually a queen of Israel, okay? And that the queen of Israel was earlier in the 1st century BC and plays part of the backstory for the nativity, okay? So she has 2 sons, okay? Traditionally, the eldest son is supposed to become the next ruler, okay? But the elder son actually wasn't as well qualified as the younger son. The younger son probably would have been a little bit better king, right? So, of course, the younger son, he's not going to sit still for that. He's going to try to make himself king, right? So they had a civil war, and they went back and forth. And like I said, we're going to talk all about that. But that's that is that's only a small part of the historical context, right? So now enter Herod the Great, okay, who is not Jewish by blood. So he can't technically be a legitimate king of the Jews. It's not possible, Okay. He's of the wrong bloodline entirely, let alone of the tribe of Judah and the house of David. Okay. But then he married into this bloodline that I'm talking about, of these feuding brothers, right? He married into that bloodline. So at least that bloodline, okay, was considered to be a pseudo-legitimate, okay? It's questionable whether they were of the house of David as well, and they probably weren't, but at least they were accepted as being Judeans, right? But Herod married into that bloodline, which meant many of his wives and children, because he was a polygamist, he had multiple wives, they had a better claim to the throne than he did. So because he was power hungry and ambitious, he was very paranoid about his throne. So he would kill someone who was a threat to his throne, right? So this was completely in keeping with Herod's character that he would do this. So when Jesus is born and the Magi show up and the Magi say, hey, where is he who was born King of the Jews? Well, Herod formulates this plot to have him murdered, right? And I have to suspect Herod would normally make a show of this kind of thing. I don't think that's what he did on this occasion. I think on this occasion, he sent a small contingent of troops to Bethlehem and murdered the male children under 2 years old. And I don't believe the number was all that high, okay? And here's a fun trivia fact. This is part of the reason I don't believe the numbers are all that high. I believe it was less than 20 children, right? It wasn't 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000. It was probably 8 to 10 to maybe 12 to maybe 20 at the most. And part of the reason I think it was limited is because Jesus would have been 15 months old at the time, which meant that John the Baptist would have been 21 months old at the time, which means John the Baptist would have fallen within Herod's margin of error, which means if he had found John the Baptist would have been murdered, okay? John the Baptist was only about 6 or 7 miles away. So what that leads me to conclude is that Herod's search was limited to a smaller area here again than tradition has led us to believe. But my point, to get back to my point here, is that how often is that ever included in the traditional nativity story? Are we ever told about the slaughter of the innocents, right? When we hear the traditional nativity story, it's almost always limited to Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem, back of a donkey, no room in the inn. Jesus gives birth in a stable, right? The angels appear to the shepherds. The shepherds come and they find the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Then the Magi show up. The Magi, the same night, according to tradition, right? The Magi show up. The Magi present their gifts. And then we wrap up the traditional version of the story. And we just don't go there with the story of the slaughter of the innocents because, hey, that's too violent. And we're telling a children's story after all. You know, it's a children's nativity story. So we just don't go there, right? So now with that in mind, let me show you this. Let me pull this up because once again, I'm not the only person who thinks like this, all right? I am not the only person. So look at this quote. Now, I'm a huge fan of John Eldredge. I think John Eldredge's books are absolutely magnificent. His books on relationships, Wild at Heart is great. Captivating, that he wrote with his wife Stacy, is great. Moving Mountains on Prayer is fabulous. Love and War, another great book on marriage, is fabulous. But this is from his book, Moving Mountains, on page 18. So it's relatively early in the book. Read this quote. He's talking about the imagery of the traditional nativity story. And he writes, I understand the imagery is very dear to many of us, but I also feel it is profoundly deceiving. it creates all sorts of warm feelings, associations, and expectations, many quite subconscious of what the nature of the Christian life is going to be like for us. The emissions are, in fact, dangerous. See? And I completely agree with him that the traditional nativity story paints an unrealistic expectation of what the Christian life can be like. When we look at the Bible unfiltered, and that is hugely important. When we look at the Bible unfiltered, there is all kinds of danger, and people are in trouble all the time. The number of the apostles and disciples that were martyred, right? The number of prophets that were murdered, right? The wars and the rumors of wars and all this stuff. The Bible is, like I said, unfiltered is a good word for it. The Bible presents humanity in a very unfiltered fashion, and we have to be very cautious about filtering it and washing it through a rose-colored filter that just is not accurate at all, right? And that's a big problem with the traditional nativity story, is we've put on these blinders and we only look at the story through those blinders. So this is fundamental premise number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th. Fundamental premise number two, tradition is not evidence. We need to wipe the slate clean, start over from the beginning, and build the evidence piece by piece by piece. Fundamental premise number three is that the traditional version of the story is rarely told in its historical context. And then fundamental premise number four is that we have obliterated the Jewishness of the nativity story. Okay. And we will come back to this over and over and over again. And this is one of the reasons I call the traditional nativity story Christian mythology, is because it's simply not a Christian story. We have reverse engineered it into a Christian story. We are looking backwards. Once again, we're looking backwards through this Christmas concept viewfinder, right? We're looking backwards through the lens of nativity plays and Christmas cards and Christmas carols, all of which are ridiculously inaccurate, right? So we're looking backwards through time and we superimpose those ideas on the nativity. And they weren't there. They just weren't there. The nativity is a Jewish story, okay? Joseph and Mary were Jewish, and everything they would have done would have attested to that fact. And once again, we're going to talk about the backstory. The background story, they were Judeans. Judea is a southern tribe, and yet they were living in the north. They were living in Galilee. So why are Judeans living in Galilee in the north? There's a really good reason. And I'm gonna bait you with that one. I'm gonna cliffhang you on that one. I'm not gonna tell you today. You're gonna have to tune in again to find out why were there Judeans living in Galilee. Why? Okay, there's a really good reason. But they were Jewish. Okay, everything they would have done, everything they would have said and done was Jewish. When the angel appeared to Joseph, right? Joseph has discovered that Mary is pregnant, right? And at first, he doesn't believe her story. She tells him how she got pregnant, and he evidently does not believe it because he has determined to divorce her. Now, he's determined to divorce her quietly, so to speak, okay? He's not going to publicly shame her, but he is determined to divorce her. And then an angel appears to him in a dream, and how does the angel address him? He says, Joseph, son of David. Joseph, son of David, is how he addresses him. So he is addressing him according to covenant history and the royal bloodline of the house of David. Okay, that is a gut level appeal to, frankly, what we would call a patriot. Okay, Joseph is very patriotic and very devoted to the kingdom of God that he knows will be ushered in by the Mashiach Nagid. So what does the angel do but say, Joseph, son of David, fear not to take unto you Mary as your wife, right? Amazing stuff that's packed into this if you know what to look for. But once again, real quickly, this is fundamental premise number 4. We have obliterated the Jewishness of the story. And that is to our detriment, because it is the Jewishness of the story that provides us with significance and relevance. Okay. And we're going to talk a lot about that. We got a lot of time to talk about this story and really unpack it. But there they are, ladies and gentlemen. Those are the 4 fundamental premises of God Save the King. Number 1, he wasn't born on December 25th. Number 2, tradition is not evidence. Number 3, we remove it from its historical context. And then number 4, we remove it from its Jewishness. Those are the things we need to overcome and reverse and look at the real date that he was born, okay? Look at the evidence, not the tradition, right? Put it in its historical context and then return the Jewishness to the story. And lo and behold, what you will discover is this amazing story that is the real nativity story. So that's where we're going to wrap it up for today. I'm really thankful that you tuned in. I hope that you got something from that. Again, my name is Tim Keyes, and this is God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Once again, you can tune into the Truth Be Told Radio Network at truthbetoldnetwork.org and click on the big listen button. My show broadcasts Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. You can listen to it then. And once again, you can listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network on a bunch of other formats: the Android app, MyTuner, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn Radio, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. And of course, you can call in at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977. Again, this is Tim Keyes of GodSaveTheKing.org for the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Signing off. Everybody have a great day. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.